Jake never thought finding a roommate would be this weird. He posted his ad on the university board like everyone else. Looking for clean, quiet roommate to share two-bedroom apartment, split rent and utilities. Simple enough, right? Most people who called were typical college students. Some were too messy, others too loud, and a few just gave him bad vibes during the phone interviews. Then Zara called. Her voice had this interesting accent he couldn't place, and she seemed almost too eager to move in immediately. "I can pay 3 months' rent up front," she said during their brief phone conversation. "I am very clean and will not disturb your studies." Jake almost said yes right away. 3 months up front? That would solve his money problems instantly. But something made him pause. "Where are you from originally?" There was a long silence. "Eastern Europe. Very small country. You probably have not heard of it." Fair enough. Jake had terrible geography. Skills anyway. They arranged to meet the next day. When Zara showed up at his apartment, Jake's first thought was that she looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Tall, with striking silver blonde hair and the most unusual pale blue eyes he'd ever seen. She wore all black clothes that looked expensive but somehow old-fashioned. "This place is adequate," she said, walking through the apartment slowly. She stopped at every window, looking out carefully. She examined the locks on the front door for a long time. "Very secure. Good." "Are you worried about safety?" Jake asked. "This is actually a pretty safe neighborhood." "Safety is always important," she replied, but didn't explain further. What really caught Jake's attention was how she reacted to normal things. When he showed her the kitchen, she stared at the microwave like it might explode. She opened the refrigerator and jumped back slightly when the light came on. "First time living away from home?" Jake asked gently. "Something like that," Zara murmured. Despite her odd behavior, she seemed harmless enough. She had cash for the deposit, spoke politely, and promised to keep the place clean. Jake needed the money, so he decided to take the risk. "Welcome home," he said, shaking her surprisingly cold hand. The first week living with Zara was like nothing Jake had ever experienced. She moved in with just 2 small suitcases and what looked like a very old trunk. No furniture, no decorations, no normal college stuff at all. She was incredibly neat. Jake would mess up the kitchen making breakfast, and by the time he got home from classes, everything would be spotless. Not just clean, but organized in ways that actually made more sense than how he'd had things arranged. But her schedule was completely backwards. Jake would hear her moving around all night, sometimes talking quietly to herself in that language he couldn't identify. During the day, especially when it was sunny, she stayed in her room with heavy curtains drawn. "I have very bad jet lag," she explained when Jake asked about it. "My body clock is still adjusted to my home country's time zone." That made sense, except Jake had looked up time zones, and nowhere in Eastern Europe was 12 hours different from their location. But maybe she was just a natural night person who was embarrassed about it. Her eating habits were even stranger. She never seemed to eat regular food. Jake would offer to share his pizza or make extra pasta, but she always politely declined. Instead, she survived on weird combinations of things she bought herself. Raw vegetables mixed with what looked like protein powder. Strange dark liquids that smelled metallic. Once he caught her eating what appeared to be plain salt with a spoon. "Special diet," she explained when she noticed him staring. "For my health condition." Jake didn't push. Everyone had their quirks, right? The weirdest thing was how she reacted to technology. She would stand in front of the television for minutes, just watching the screen with intense fascination, even when it was turned off. She asked him to explain how the microwave worked 3 different times, taking notes in a small book with symbols instead of letters. "Your country must be really remote," Jake said one evening, trying to make conversation while they sat in the living room. "Very isolated," Zara agreed. "We do not have many of these modern conveniences." "But you have electricity, right? And phones, since you called me?" Another long pause. Basic electricity. Very basic. Jake found himself getting curious about where exactly she was from. When he asked direct questions, her answers were always vague. The country was small and mountainous. The weather was cold most of the year. They had their own language that wasn't related to other European languages. "What's it called?" he asked one night. "You would not be able to pronounce it correctly," she said quickly. "The sounds are very difficult for outsiders." The more Jake thought about it, the more mysterious Zara became. She never got mail. She never used the apartment's internet, even though Jake had offered to share the password. She never made phone calls that he could hear, but sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and hear her having quiet conversations in her room. When he listened carefully, it sounded like she was speaking to someone, but he never heard another voice. Despite all the oddities, Jake found that he actually enjoyed having her as a roommate. She was respectful of his space, never left messes, and somehow made the apartment feel more peaceful. She was also surprisingly good company when she was awake during his evening hours. She would ask thoughtful questions about his classes, his photography hobby, and his plans for the future. "You seem very focused on capturing images," she observed one night when Jake was showing her some photos he'd taken around campus. "Yeah, I love photography. It's like freezing a moment in time, you know? Preserving something beautiful or interesting forever." Zara studied the photos with an expression Jake couldn't read. "And these images, they show exactly what was there? Nothing more, nothing less? Well, you can edit them and stuff, but yeah, basically they're just recordings of what the camera sees." "Fascinating," she murmured. But she looked troubled rather than impressed. Jake was starting to think that maybe Zara came from some kind of religious community where technology was forbidden or limited. That would explain her fascination with modern appliances and her odd reactions to normal things. Maybe she was trying to experience the outside world for the first time. Whatever her story was, Jake decided he liked having her around. She was probably the most interesting roommate he'd ever have. Jake had been saving money for months, working extra shifts at the campus bookstore and eating nothing but ramen noodles for weeks. His photography professor had been hinting all semester that serious photography students needed serious equipment, and Jake was determined to prove he was serious. When his financial aid refund finally came through, Jake knew exactly what he was going to do with it. He'd been researching cameras and lenses for months, reading reviews, comparing prices, and dreaming about the day he could afford professional gear. The packages started arriving on a Tuesday morning. Jake heard the delivery truck pull up and practically ran to the door. The driver looked overwhelmed as he wheeled in box after box. "Photography equipment?" the driver asked, checking his list. "Christmas morning for adults," Jake grinned, signing for each package. Once the driver left, Jake spread all the boxes across the living room floor. He felt like a kid again, trying to decide which present to open first. He started with the camera. Body, carefully cutting through the tape and lifting out the sleek black DSLR. It felt substantial in his hands, professional and serious. Next came the lenses. A versatile 24-70mm for general shooting, a 50mm portrait lens that his professor swore by, and a telephoto lens for sports and wildlife photography. Each lens came in its own protective case, nested in foam like precious jewels. The lighting equipment was equally exciting. A professional flash unit that could be used on or off camera, light stands that extended to over 6 feet tall, reflectors for bouncing light, and diffusers for creating soft, even illumination. Jake had watched countless YouTube tutorials about lighting techniques, and now he finally had the tools to try them himself. He spent the entire afternoon unpacking, reading instruction manuals, and testing different combinations. The camera had dozens of settings and custom functions. Each lens created completely different looks and perspectives. The lighting gear opened up possibilities he'd only dreamed about. By evening, Jake had transformed the living room into what looked like a professional photography studio. The coffee table was covered with camera bodies, lenses, memory cards, batteries, and cables. Light stands occupied 3 corners of the room, with reflectors and diffusers carefully arranged nearby. His new tripod stood ready in the center, sturdy enough to hold even the heaviest telephoto lens. Jake couldn't resist taking test shots of everything. He photographed his textbooks with dramatic lighting, captured artistic shots of everyday objects around the apartment, and practiced different techniques he'd been learning about. The camera's LCD screen showed crisp, vibrant images that made his old point-and-shoot camera look like a toy. As he worked, Jake lost track of time completely. He was in what his psychology professor would call a flow state, completely absorbed in learning his new equipment. He barely noticed that the apartment had become unusually quiet. Normally, he could hear Zara moving around in her room during the evening hours, but tonight there was complete silence. Around midnight, Jake finally decided to call it a night. He left all his equipment arranged on the coffee table, planning to continue experimenting the next day. The camera looked magnificent under the living room lights, surrounded by its collection of lenses and accessories like a technological shrine. Before going to bed, Jake took one more shot, using the camera's timer function to photograph the entire setup. He wanted to remember this moment, the night he finally became a serious photographer. In the photo, the equipment looked even more impressive than in person, each piece clearly defined and professionally arranged. As Jake headed to his bedroom, he thought he heard a small sound from Zara's room, like a sharp intake of breath or maybe a quiet gasp. But when he paused to listen, everything was silent again. Probably just the building settling, he muttered to himself. Jake fell asleep that night, dreaming about all the amazing photos he was going to take. Portraits with beautiful background blur, landscapes with perfect sharpness, action shots frozen in time. His photography was about to reach a whole new level. He had no idea that in the next room, Zara was having a very different kind of reaction to his new equipment. While Jake saw creative possibilities and artistic potential, Zara saw something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her human roommate. The next morning would bring conversations that neither of them expected, and revelations that would change their entire relationship. But for now, Jake slept peacefully, surrounded by the tools that would unknowingly bridge 2 worlds. Jake couldn't ignore the mounting evidence anymore. His roommate wasn't just culturally different or religiously conservative about technology. Something much stranger was going on, and it all seemed to center around his photography equipment. Next morning, Jake decided to do some investigating of his own. After Zara retreated to her room for her usual daytime sleep, he quietly searched the internet for any information about Eastern European countries with technology taboos. He found some religious communities that avoided modern conveniences, but none that matched Zara's specific reactions. He tried searching for the geographical details she'd mentioned about her homeland: mountainous, cold, isolated, with its own, unrelated language. But every combination of search terms came up empty. There were plenty of small countries in Eastern Europe, but none that fit all of her descriptions. Jake even tried looking up the symbols he'd glimpsed in her notebook. He searched through alphabets, mathematical notation, and ancient writing systems. The closest thing he could find were some astronomical symbols, but even those weren't quite right. By the time Zara emerged from her room that evening, Jake had made a decision. He was going to get some real answers. "Hey, Zara," he said casually, as she made her way to the kitchen. "I've been thinking about your country. What's the capital city called?" She paused, her hand on the refrigerator door. "The capital?" "Yeah, you know, the biggest city, where the government is located. It is difficult to pronounce. The sounds do not exist in English. Could you try? I'm really curious about your culture." Zara opened the refrigerator and stared inside for a long moment. "Cathalara," she said finally. Jake blinked. That didn't sound like any European language he'd ever heard. It sounded almost otherworldly. And what's the name of your country again? Another long pause. Veltar. Jake nodded, pretending to find this perfectly normal, but he was making mental notes. Later that night, he searched for both names and found absolutely nothing. No country, no city, no references anywhere on the internet. The next few days, Jake started paying closer attention to all of Zara's behaviors. Her reactions to normal technology weren't just unfamiliarity, they showed a completely different understanding of how things worked. When the microwave beeped, she would tilt her head as if listening to some hidden meaning in the sound. When the television screen flickered, she would watch intently, as if expecting it to do something televisions don't normally do. Most tellingly, Jake realized that Zara never seemed surprised by things that should have been surprising. She adapted to American culture incredibly quickly for someone from an isolated, traditional background. She understood social cues, pop culture references, and modern concepts almost as if she'd studied them extensively, but his photography equipment continued to terrify her. Jake decided to test a theory. One evening, he deliberately left his camera on the coffee table and hid in his bedroom with the door cracked open, watching through the gap. Around midnight, Zara emerged from her room. Instead of avoiding the living room as usual, she approached the camera very slowly, like someone approaching a dangerous animal. She circled the coffee table multiple times, examining the equipment from different angles. Then she pulled out that notebook and began writing rapidly, glancing between the camera and her symbols. She seemed to be documenting every detail, the model numbers, the button layouts, the lens specifications. Most strangely, she held her hand near the camera without touching it, as if testing for something. Heat? Radiation? Jake couldn't tell. But she seemed to be sensing something that wasn't visible. After about 20 minutes of this careful examination, Zara suddenly froze. She tilted her head as if listening to something Jake couldn't hear. Then she quickly closed her notebook and hurried back to her room. That's when Jake heard it. A soft electronic beeping coming from her room. Not like a phone or computer, but something with a more complex pattern. It sounded almost like communication signals. Jake's mind started racing. What if Zara wasn't from Eastern Europe at all? What if she was from somewhere much more distant? That would explain her strange reactions to Earth technology, her backward sleep schedule, her unusual diet, and her intense interest in documenting his equipment. It would also explain why his photography gear scared her so much. If she wasn't human, the electronic components, especially the flash and sensors, might interfere with whatever biological systems she used. To her, his innocent camera equipment might look like sophisticated surveillance or weapons technology. The more Jake thought about it, the more sense it made. Zara's behavior wasn't the result of cultural differences. It was the behavior of someone trying to blend in with a completely alien species. But if that was true, what was she really doing here? Was she studying humans? Was she planning something? And why had she chosen him as a roommate? Jake spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to process this possibility. His boring college life had suddenly become the most extraordinary situation he could imagine. He was living with someone who might not even be from Earth. The question now was what to do about it. Should he confront her directly? Should he try to gather more evidence first? Should he contact someone, though he had no idea who would believe such a story? One thing was certain. Tomorrow's conversation with Zara was going to be unlike any conversation he'd ever had in his life. Jake barely slept that night. By morning, he'd made up his mind. He couldn't keep pretending everything was normal when his roommate might literally be from another world. The situation had gone way beyond cultural differences and photography taboos. When Zara emerged from her room that evening, Jake was waiting for her in the living room. He'd moved his camera equipment to one side and arranged 2 chairs facing each other in the center of the room. Zara, we need to talk, he said, gently but firmly. She looked at the setup and seemed to understand that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. About what? About who you really are and where you're really from. Jake watched her face carefully. For just a moment, her carefully maintained human expressions slipped, and he saw something that looked like panic, then resignation. I do not understand what you mean, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I've been doing some research, Jake said carefully. I can't find any country called Veltar. I can't find any city called Cathalara. Those names don't exist anywhere on Earth. Zara sat down slowly in the chair across from him. She was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her having some kind of internal struggle. You also react to technology in ways that don't make sense for someone from an isolated human culture, Jake continued. You seem to understand it too well, but you're also afraid of it in specific ways, especially my camera equipment. Your equipment, Zara began, then stopped herself. What about my equipment, Zara? What does it really do that scares you so much? Another long silence. Then, so quietly Jake almost missed it, she said, It interferes with my natural abilities. What kind of natural abilities? Zara looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, her expression was completely genuine. No careful human mask, no practiced responses. My people communicate through bioelectric fields, she said slowly. We can sense electromagnetic signatures, share thoughts across distances, and perceive energy patterns that humans cannot detect. Your photography equipment, especially the electronic sensors and flash units, disrupts all of that. Jake felt his heart racing, but he tried to keep his voice calm. Your people? I am part of a cultural exchange program, Zara said, and despite everything, Jake almost laughed at how mundane that sounded. But not the kind you assumed. My species has been observing Earth for several decades. I am among the first to live, directly among humans, for an extended period. You're an alien, Jake said, and somehow saying it out loud made it feel both more real and more surreal. That is your word for it, yes. Jake leaned back in his chair, trying to process this confirmation of what he'd suspected. So when I got all that camera gear, I thought you had discovered my true nature, Zara admitted. In my panic, I believed you were preparing to document me, perhaps to expose me to your authorities. I contacted my supervisors and nearly caused them to end the entire exchange program. Because of camera equipment? From my perspective, you had suddenly acquired sophisticated electronic surveillance devices. The electromagnetic signatures they produce are overwhelming to my senses. I could not understand why a simple human student would need such advanced technology, unless you suspected something. Jake found himself smiling despite the incredible situation. So you thought I was some kind of alien hunter? It seemed like the most logical explanation for your sudden acquisition of sensing equipment. Zara, it's photography equipment. I take pictures with it. You know, for art projects and school assignments. Zara tilted her head, studying him. You create visual records for aesthetic purposes? Exactly. That's all it is. I'm not a government agent or an alien investigator. I'm just a college student who wants to be a photographer. For the first time in weeks, Zara's posture relaxed slightly. So you do not suspect me of being different? Well, I do now, Jake said with a grin. But only because you've been acting so weird about my camera gear. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both adjusting to this new reality. So, Jake said finally, what's it actually like, being from another world? Zara's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Would you really like to know? For the next several hours, they talked like they never had before. Zara described her homeworld, a planet with 3 moons and purple skies, where her species had developed technology that worked in harmony with their natural bioelectric abilities. She explained her mission on Earth, studying human culture and behavior to help her people better understand their neighbors in the galaxy. Jake shared his own dreams and experiences, seeing his ordinary human life through Zara's fascinated perspective. His photography hobby, his college classes, even his weekend job at the bookstore became interesting when viewed as examples of human culture and creativity. "I have one request," Zara said as their conversation wound down. "Could you teach me about photography? I understand now that it is an art form, not surveillance technology. I would like to learn about human creative expression." Jake grinned. "I'd love to, but I should warn you, my flash units might be uncomfortable for you." "I will adapt," Zara said with determination. This cultural exchange should go both ways. As they shook hands to seal their new friendship, Jake realized that his ordinary college experience had just become the most extraordinary adventure of his life. He'd gained not just a roommate, but a friend from literally another world. And it had all started with a misunderstanding about photography equipment. Jake woke up the next morning with the excited feeling of a kid on Christmas. He dreamed about photography all night and couldn't wait to continue experimenting with his new equipment. He padded out to the living room in his pajamas, expecting to find everything exactly where he'd left it. The equipment was still there, arranged on the coffee table just as he'd positioned it the night before. But something felt different. Jake couldn't put his finger on it at first, then he noticed small details that seemed off. The dust patterns around the table had been disturbed, as if someone had walked around it very carefully, examining everything from different angles. One of his lens caps had been moved slightly. A memory card that he'd left beside the camera was now positioned at a slightly different angle. "Weird," Jake muttered, looking around the apartment. That's when he noticed Zara, sitting at the kitchen table, completely motionless. She was staring directly at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Her usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Morning, Zara," Jake said casually, heading toward the coffee maker. "Sleep okay?" She didn't respond immediately. When Jake glanced back at her, she was still staring, her pale blue eyes wider than normal. "Jake," she said finally, her voice sounding strained. "We must discuss your equipment." Jake looked toward his photography gear, then back at Zara. "My camera stuff? What about it?" "You acquired these devices yesterday," she said, speaking more carefully than usual. "Multiple devices. Very sophisticated devices." "Yeah, I've been saving up for months. Pretty exciting, right? I can finally take the kind of photos I've been wanting to create." Zara's expression became even more puzzled. "Photos?" "Pictures." "No. Images?" Jake mimed holding a camera and pressing the shutter button. The moment Jake made the camera gesture, Zara flinched backward in her chair as if he'd pointed a weapon at her. She made a small, distressed sound that was barely audible. "Zara, are you okay?" Jake asked, genuinely concerned. "Did I do something wrong?" "In my culture," she began slowly, "such devices are forbidden." Jake set down his coffee mug and sat across from her at the table. "Cameras are forbidden? Is it a religious thing?" "They capture—" She struggled to find words, switching briefly to that unknown language before continuing in English. "They capture essence, parts of the soul." This was fascinating to Jake. He'd heard of cultures where people believed photographs could steal souls, but he'd never met anyone who actually held those beliefs. "I totally understand that," Jake said gently. "Some Native American tribes have similar beliefs, but I promise it's just light hitting a sensor. No souls involved." Zara looked at him skeptically. "You use these devices to record light?" "Exactly. The camera captures light reflecting off objects and creates an image. It's purely mechanical and electronic. No magic or soul stealing involved." But instead of looking relieved, Zara seemed even more troubled by this explanation. Over the next few days, Zara's behavior became increasingly strange. She avoided the living room entirely, taking elaborate routes through the apartment that kept her as far as possible from Jake's photography equipment. When she needed to get to the kitchen, she would press herself against the wall and move quickly, as if the camera might suddenly activate on its own. Jake tried to be understanding. He offered to put the equipment away when he wasn't using it. But Zara insisted that wasn't necessary. She claimed she was just being overly cautious about cultural taboos. "Maybe I could show you how it works," Jake suggested one evening. "Once you see that it's just a tool like a paintbrush or a pen, you might feel more comfortable." "No." Zara's response was immediate and sharp. Then, more quietly, "I mean, thank you, but that would not be appropriate." Jake noticed that whenever he was actually using the camera, taking photos around the apartment or reviewing images on the LCD screen, Zara would disappear entirely. She would retreat to her room, and he wouldn't see her again until he'd put all the equipment away. Her sleep schedule became even more erratic. Jake would hear her pacing in her room at all hours, sometimes having those quiet conversations that seemed to be getting more frequent and more urgent. Once he thought he heard her crying, but when he knocked on her door to check if she was okay, she claimed everything was fine. The situation reached a breaking point on Friday evening. Jake came home from his photography class to find Zara standing in the living room, staring intensely at his camera equipment. She was closer to it than he'd seen her since that first morning, standing just a few feet away from the coffee table. She was speaking rapidly in her native language, and Jake could see that she was holding a small notebook, writing symbols that definitely weren't from any alphabet he recognized. The symbols looked almost geometric, like a combination of mathematics and art. "Zara," Jake said softly, not wanting to startle her. She spun around, clutching the notebook to her chest. For just a moment, Jake saw something in her eyes that looked like panic, or maybe guilt. "I was just examining your equipment," she said quickly, "for cultural research purposes." "Cultural research?" "To better understand how different societies use technology," she said, backing toward her room, "for my studies." But Jake had been living with her for weeks now, and he'd never seen her do any studying. She didn't have textbooks, didn't use the internet, never went to classes or met with other students. What kind of cultural research was she really doing? That night, Jake lay in bed listening to the sounds from Zara's room. The conversations seemed more intense than ever, and he could swear he heard electronic beeping sounds, like some kind of communication device. But when he'd helped her move in, she hadn't brought any electronics at all. Something was definitely not right with his mysterious roommate, and Jake was starting to suspect that her interest in his photography equipment was about much more than cultural taboos.